Hey everyone, welcome to the Hobby Lobby Creative Studio. I'm Sarah. Not sure which yarn to buy? I'll show you how to read a yarn label so that you can be sure that you're buying exactly the right yarn that you need for your project. Don't go away. As soon as you travel to the yarn section in Hobby Lobby, you quickly realize that there are a ton of options in front of you. From color to style, weight, and texture, how do you know what to choose? Well, of course you want to choose something that you love the look of, but is it going to hold up in the wash? Can you iron it? Is it going to shrink? Is it even the right thickness that you need for your project? We often overlook the information that could really help us out on a yarn label, or maybe it's that we just don't really understand what it is that we're looking at. So get ready for a few pointers and I'll show you why all that information is useful to you and your project. Not all yarn labels are laid out exactly the same way, but the information that you can find on them is generally the same. So for example, I have some Baby Bee yarn here in front of me, and the first thing I notice is that there is a free pattern included. So that's a really great bonus to find on these labels. Rotating down a little bit further now, we see something called a lot number. A lot number is kind of like the yarn's color identity. If the lot number that is stamped on the label is the same on multiple skeins, then that means that every one of those skeins of yarn should be the exact same color. However, if the number here differs on those skeins, then there might be a chance that those colors just vary a little bit. So a good tip is that if you're making a project that requires a lot of the same color of yarn, make sure that all of your skeins have the same dye lot number stamped on them to guarantee that your entire project turns out to be the same color. Rotating the label a little bit further now, we see some general information about the yarn. So here the fiber content is indicated, and then here we have the weight class of the yarn, as well as this section which tells us how long all this yarn measures out to be. Yarn weights are measured from 0 to 6, with 0 being the finest and 6 being the bulkiest weight of yarn. Next on our label, we see some laundry care symbols. These are especially important if you're making a piece of apparel or something that you're going to have to wash, because you need to know what you're going to be able to subject it to without harming it. So laundry care symbols will tell you information like whether or not you can put that yarn into the dryer, if you can take it to the dry cleaners, if you can iron it, and even the temperature that the water should be whenever you launder it. The next little bit of information that you'll see on your label is something called a gauge. Whenever you're working from a pattern, it will usually recommend that you make a test swatch or gauge to check the tension of your stitches in either knitting or crochet. Now everybody knits and crochets a little bit differently from each other, some more tightly and some more loosely. Neither way is more right or wrong than the other, but the tension that you produce directly affects the number of stitches that you get in between points A and B. So that amount of stitches will directly affect the final look and the fit of your finished garment. So we need to check our work whenever we're working from a pattern and make sure that the amount of tension that we produce naturally matches the amount of tension indicated on the pattern. So in other words, we have to check the amount of stitches that we get in a certain area to the amount of stitches required for that certain pattern. So typically when you make a gauge, you either knit or crochet a little square like this that's 4 inches by 4 inches. So go ahead and use the recommended needle or hook size indicated on the yarn's label when you make your first test swatch. So then what you're going to do is take a tape measure or a ruler, and you're going to measure the amount of stitches that fall in between a 4-inch line going across. So on this, we're going to measure how many single crochets fall in between that 4-inch area, and then you're going to measure how many rows go up a 4-inch line, just like this. So here my gauge is a little bit bigger than 4 inches by 4 inches, and that's okay. All we're worried about is what is inside that 4-inch area. So you can just kind of put your ruler or your tape measure anywhere inside here and then count the number of stitches within that 4-inch area. So here's what I'm comparing those numbers to on the yarn label. So right here, this is an example of a crochet gauge. So I'm going to look at the crochet reference for the gauge on here. And it tells me that I need 16 single crochets across and 20 rows up for this gauge. So if I have more than 16 stitches across and more than 20 rows up like this, that means my tension is tight, and to compensate, I can use a hook size that's a size or 2 larger, making my stitches larger, which will take up more space in that area, and I'll have less stitches in that 4-inch line, and then I'll be closer to that recommended stitch count. On the flip side of that, if I have less than 16 stitches across and less than 20 rows up, then my tension is loose, and to compensate, I can use a hook size that's a size or 2 smaller, making my stitches smaller and producing more stitches in that area, and coming closer to that recommended stitch count. So now that you know why a gauge is important to make before you start a project, here's how you make a gauge. It's really simple, actually. So all you're going to do for a crochet gauge, for example, is start off with a slip knot, just like you would any other project, and then you're going to chain over till you get to at least 4 inches. And it's okay if you want to go a little bit bigger than that as well. And then you're just going to start your single crochet stitch, because the single crochet stitch is the stitch indicated on our yarn label for us to test our gauge. And you're going to do that all the way back across your foundational row of chains that you just made. And then of course at the end of that row, you're going to chain 2, turn your work, and then start your single crochet stitch all the way back across that row. Turn your work, chain 2 again, and continue to do that over and over and build up your rows until you get to at least 4 inches high. So you're going to end up with a 4-inch across square by a 4-inch up square, and that's as big as you need to go to measure your gauge. And then of course, take out your ruler or your tape measure and make sure your swatch is not stretched out, that it's just laying nice and flat on the table. And then you're going to count how many stitches you have in between this 4-inch area here going across, and then count how many rows you have going up your swatch in that same 4-inch area. So then compare those 2 numbers to the 2 numbers required for that gauge information on your yarn label, and then you can just adjust your hook or your needle size accordingly. So now that you know how to read all the basic information found on a yarn label and how to make a gauge, you're ready to go. So go ahead and head to your nearest Hobby Lobby and check out all the great yarn that they have to offer and find some inspiration for your next project. Thanks for stopping by, everybody. We'll see you next time.